We've had three really rich presentations on different aspects of our theme of China's growing global impact. Let me just make a few comments to try to draw them together. One I think is, I think I mentioned we often talk about China as if it's this monolith, but China is actually extraordinarily complex on so many different areas. And one of the things that's come through these presentations is the difference between center and locality. And China's very, it's an enormous country, and you've got Beijing, and too much of what we focus on is Beijing and forgetting what goes on at the local level. So, I mean, we've talked about consumerism, we've talked about jail situation, and Mark talking about all of these wind turbines in Gansu. You know, how many people could find Gansu on the map? And yet they've got this huge effort on wind, generating energy through wind. So there's this in all these different kinds of complexity, I think, are extremely important. And one of the things that sort of helped, I think, can make us a little more sympathetic to the Chinese government is how do you try to manage all of that, and how much should you try to manage? We've seen this interplay between, I talked about unity and disunity, and there's also the Chinese, certainly under the communists, talk about a dialectic between what they call shou and fang. Shou means to restrict, fang means to liberate. So you've got this ongoing movement between periods of tightening and periods of loosening. And some people would argue that China is now in one of these periods of tightening, where John talked about crackdown on corruption, and there's been crackdown on minorities and so-called separatism and so on. Many people feel that it's this period of cracking down has gone on too long and waiting for the next period of liberalization, but we're not sure how far down the horizon that is. John's talked about image. There's a whole issue here about most of the stories about China in the American media are negative in nature. Is they'll seize on some negative aspect about Chinese society, Chinese politics, Chinese economy, Chinese environment, and then, or even if a positive story, there's some sort of a negative spin that's put on it. I find in most of the American media, in particular. Well, the truth is somewhere in the middle. It's not, the public relations. You can tell a public relations story, but what is the substance you're trying to present? As whoever famously talked about putting lipstick on a pig. There's some things that you just can't pretty up. And when do you present something honestly? And the difference between presenting something honestly and trying to justify something that is really not very pleasant. It's a contradiction. And then just finally, on this question of China's growing global impact, we've heard about the environment, we've heard about consumerism, we've heard about human rights, and all of these are very much intertwined. None of these can be really understood separately from the others. China's rise has been in large part due to its successful utilization of many of the opportunities presented in the global economic system created and maintained by the United States, especially since the end of the Cold War with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The U.S. is the one superpower, and so much of what goes on in the world has been dominated by the U.S. And China has taken really sophisticated advantage of a lot of the opportunities to grow its economy, to grow its military potential, and even though with great inequality there has been the rise of a middle class, they've brought, the figure's usually 300 million people out of poverty. There have been just enormous social changes. So China has utilized this system very successfully. And the one question that's in the minds of so many people is, does China want to maintain this system the way it is because it's done so well, or does China want to subvert it? Some of the older members in the room are aware of the period of the Cultural Revolution when China was leading global revolution. They were exporting revolution. They weren't exporting goods to Walmart. So now there's still a lot of suspicion. Does China want to subvert this system, or is China a responsible stakeholder, wants to maintain this system which they have done so well in? And there's no easy answer. The Chinese say, our rise is a peaceful rise. We have no desire to subvert the system, to overturn things, to take land away from anybody else. But the scale of China, and this comes through in all of these presentations, the scale of China is so great on everything that intentionally or unintentionally it's going to have an impact on the way that the world operates and the things that we take for granted. And a lot of the rhetoric that you hear coming out of Washington is about how should we manage China's rise, which I think is totally misleading. it's not up to us to manage China's rise. China is China. China is going to do, there's a whole lot of momentum coming out of there. They've got their dream is the state dream. They've got individual dreams, as we've heard. And the United States has neither the capability or, I think anymore, the moral authority to manage anybody's rise. Sorry for sermonizing here. But I think that it's something we need to consider when we think about U.S.-China relations, as well as about China's relations throughout the world. And I think the point that Helen made about, and it's come through everything, is about trying to understand what drives the Chinese. One of the things I tried to emphasize is the historical continuity about that. China's a very good example of this interplay between continuity and change. And it's an extremely dynamic situation, and we need to keep a very close eye on it. Haven't got a better punchline than that. So now let's open it up for comments, questions. You can either address to a specific panelist or just throw something out there and we'll send up the flagpole and see who salutes. I have another, this could be the mic. We could.
No. Okay. Of course, I want to start by thanking all the panelists, and you help us who are trying to bring the monolith of China to our students get a better grasp. And I know just from traveling through China quite a bit, I took away that there just is no one China, and there's so many ways to talk about it, and so that makes it interesting, but a challenge. So we don't have a panelist really representing the media, but I am curious, within this bigger topic of China in transition, how is the media presenting, some of these changes that you're bringing up, be it the environment or the middle class or human rights? How are they presenting it a little bit, differently over time? As maybe there's more options and more things that are available, and of course we're aware of CCTV's presentation of it. Has that even changed, and are there more media outlets that the Chinese people themselves get a better picture?
Well, let me just start with that. And one issue that Helen alluded to, and maybe she wants to talk more about that, is the role of the internet. And that you do have within China now, you talked about 500 million, 450, who knows, people who go on the internet. Now, a lot of them are going on the internet to shop, to play games, looking for pornography. They're not political dissidents. Our media tends to focus on the political dissidents and the efforts of the Chinese to create the Great Firewall, which is and how to either suppress media freedom through the internet or how to subvert it. And so that while you've got 500 million internet users, you also have, we don't know how many hundreds of thousands of Chinese who are paid to engage a lot of the dissidents on the internet. First of all, to identify them, and then also to try to engage in conversation, to try to to have them expose themselves, or to present in the guise of just another netizen, the official Chinese view, to try to counter some of the dissident views that are being presented on the internet. But Chinese media itself, so many of the things that John talked about, and one of the, you again, don't let me talk too much about you, but a lot of the work that Dui Hua does is based on using public sources. Chinese local newspapers, local radio broadcasts, reports through the internet about political prisoners, things that are going on. There's a huge amount of knowledge and debate. The Boxilai, the corruption, every day in the newspapers you see that sort of stuff. The question is, who has the right to present it, how is it presented, and can you act on it? And the environmental issues in particular. So that's just throwing out some stuff, and you guys want to comment more? I think they're on.
I wonder, your question is about how the Chinese medium present what's going on in China, or what is it exactly? Because there's a CCTV version of China. Of course, most people are suspicious about that. But other than that, I think Chinese media, that's the one area is not still very much controlling Chinese government. But Chinese people, if they want to search the truth, they can go to the internet. And a lot of young people that are very savvy, technology savvy, they know how to, they call the fanqiang, but they how to get over the great firewall to find out what's going on in the truth, if they want to search the truth. But as I said, many young people, looking for shopping, looking for other stuff. But if they really, I talk to people, if they want to find out, they know they don't believe what the government is talking about. But they also don't quite trust what West media said. They know they have prejudices. And so, but if they want, then we can go to the internet to find the truth. Anybody else?
Well, somebody. Time is running.
Nobody wants to talk.
Time for another question, perhaps.
Wait, Mark, John is going to.
Let me just say,
John.
there is certainly no question but that the Western media presentation of China is by and large negative. Occasionally, you get some positive stories, many on the economic front, but in areas like the environment, certainly human rights, the coverage is negative. There are a couple of things I'd like to say about this. First of all, the Chinese government's relations with Western journalists are not good. All right, the journalists feel that the Chinese government does not treat them well, and they in turn return the favor. I'm sure part of that is what's going on. The other thing that's going on is that China simply doesn't know how to put its best foot forward, and for that I will refer to you this week's issue of The Economist. And it's a story by Gady Epstein on the sharp reduction in the number of executions in China. And I'm featured very prominently throughout. They rely on our statistics, which I was happy to see that all the other experts agree with, that our statistics actually are accurate. In 2002, China was executing 12,000 people a year. Last year, it executed 3,000. That's a 75% drop. But how do you put this in a positive light? I mean, well, first of all, 9,000 more people are being saved from execution than was the case 10 years ago. That's pretty impressive. If you add all that up over the years, I'd say that in the last 10 years, 50,000 people who would otherwise have been executed have been spared. That's pretty impressive. But the fact of the matter is that 3,000 people are still being executed every year, and it's very hard to celebrate that. So part of it really is that the Chinese government doesn't know how to do this. The actual number of executions is a state secret. Weihua is publicizing it. The Chinese government isn't. Now, some of it is based on our own, survey of reports in the provincial press, and part of it is through interviews and what have you. But when you're in a situation where the Chinese government itself doesn't publicize something which I think on balance is positive, well, what's a Western journalist to do? They will focus on the negative, and that's what's going on.
Thank you all. Questions, please?
Maybe this is directed towards Mr. Henderson. Mr. Henderson, what is the status of water treatment in China? I traveled in 2009, and I was teaching AP Environmental at the time. I've taken a 4-year tour of the Redwood City water treatment plant. And I've seen the San Francisco one as well. I saw one water treatment plant along the Yangtze River, and it didn't appear to be functional. So I know they had big plans and they had a goal, and I just wondered where they stood in terms of their reaching that objective.
I think you're exactly on the point. With external funding and help, a lot of water treatment plants were built to international standards, and I think a fair number of them are operating, but another mile outside the city limits and probably not. Partly this is just capacity of the technical capacity of the government to monitor and to enforce and to get these things built and certified and ensure that they continue to run. So that's the short answer. The overall picture for water quality is it's about where we were when the Cuyahoga River in Ohio caught fire in the late 60s. It's too obvious for people to ignore. It's one of those things that They say if you live downstream from a textile factory, you know what color fabric they're printing this week because that's the color the river is as it runs down. So yes, some serious problems. Yes, some technical improvements, but not enough to keep up with the economic growth.
More questions?
Hi. I'm trying to wrap my head around in a nation where the youth, you're saying, in schools are learning a form of Marxism, which originally has had its a very sharp class analysis. How does that jive with the sort of growth of this new middle class? Do people get ostracized? How is this being seen? How is this being even referred to or discussed as a phenomenon?
Well, as Mark said, people, it's Chinese, they study Marxism, but really nobody really believed that. Nobody really believed what's, taught in school on class struggle. They already know, their parents' generation went through Cultural Revolution. They know how disastrous that was. And these days, that's part of one of the biggest challenge or crisis I think China is facing is really, nobody believes in communism. And but the traditional Confucianism, or there are also that doesn't quite fit in the modern world as well, and so people feel like don't have anything to hold on to, which very apparent during my interview. People talk a lot about that, and I have a particular even chapter devoted to that.
Yeah, I think it's because you're tested on it in school. You learn how to render unto Caesar. I mean, you learn how to talk the talk, even if you don't walk the walk. But interestingly, and maybe Helen wants to comment on this, I think recent studies have shown that more and more young people are joining the Communist Party. But they're not, because there was a while when they said, to hell with this, I don't want anything to do with it. But then they're joining the Communist Party because that is seen as a ticket to ride. That's like because if you want to rise through the bureaucracy, or if you want any kinds of opportunity, this is one of the key things. Now there's also a central concept in Chinese society and Chinese culture, which I've done research on, called guanxi, G-U-A-N-X-I, which we translate as connections. But it's more than just connections, it's more than just an old boy network. It's based on long-term ideas of reciprocity and doing favors for other people and establishing connections. So I mentioned that the Chinese see themselves as part of a network and not as an isolated individual. And so much of it is contextualized. And one of the things that I think Chinese are brought up with is the idea of importance of connections, of establishing connections and learning how to manipulate these. So there's no greater network in China than the Communist Party, 1 million people. And so I think a lot of it, you have to be pretty cynical. That people are evaluating their mobility opportunities, and one thing is you master this rhetoric, and then you join the party, and then you utilize it. Is that pretty fair to say?
Yeah. I just want to add one thing that hasn't come out at all in today's discussion, but you should be aware that China is the fastest growing Christian community in the world by far. There are well over 100 million Christians in China today. There are actually more Christians than there are members of the Communist Party.
Does that include Catholics?
It includes Catholics,
Yeah.
but Protestants are much bigger.
More,
Now,
yeah.
this doesn't include Buddhists, Taoists, any Muslims for sure it doesn't include. But just in terms of Christianity, it is a rapidly growing market for Christianity. And this is well recognized now.
Hi, this is focused on the environment, but it seems like what I'm hearing isn't having the United States take responsibility for some of this, because NPR this week has been doing some stories about the coal trains going to the West Coast, which will add 30 miles of trains a day, and China adding one new coal plant every week, and here you're talking about us lowering our emissions. That's because we're shifting to natural gas, but we're selling, it's kind of like the opium war. We're kind of selling the drug and selling to China, so later on we can blame them for the pollution. But just, it seems like, again, the part of it is telling the story that it's not China's being greedy, they need the energy, and we're providing the drug, you know, so
I think we can just take that as a statement. I have a good political cartoon. It was from a U.S. newspaper, but translated in Chinese of Americans sitting on this pile of stuff. Everything says "Made in China," and then pointing over the Great Wall and said, "Your emissions are too high." And that got picked up, I think, a Hong Kong newspaper, and said, "Look what they're saying about us." Obviously, it's a global problem. Both sides, though, have to be part of the solution. Both the U.S. in terms of deciding what we want to buy. Companies, even Walmart, get some credit for saying, as long as this is the way the trading systems work, we're going to try to make it as efficient and non-polluting as possible. And the Chinese side having the technical capacity to produce things that way, enforce the rules they have, and raise the standards. So.
Thank you all for a really wonderful discussion and a terrific panel, and thank you for your good questions.